Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 284. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 53 and 54 of the supplement to the Summa. That is, of the impediment of vows and orders, and of the impediment of consanguinity. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10, and so here we go. Article 1, whether marriage already contracted should be annulled by the obligation of a simple vow. A simple vow would be a vow to God that's private, a promise one can make before God, promising, for example, to take up the single life as our Lord enjoins in Matthew 19 for those who can receive it. Now, this simple vow, although it could make the marital consent illicit, if not being first dispensed of that vow, it would not make the forthcoming marriage void and uncontracted, since simple vows do not, according to their nature, transfer a man's power over his own person to another like solemn vows do. Therefore, a man under a simple vow ought to have had that vow communicated, as canon law puts it, to something else by one's local ordinary, such as their parish priest, and then gotten married, as canon law tells us. This is from Canon 1197. The person who makes a private vow can commute the work promised by the vow into a better or equal good. However, one who has the power over dispensing, according to the norm of Canon 1196, can commute it to a lesser good. However, if one's celibate vow is not transferred, again in this way, still the simple vow would not invalidate the contract of marriage. Article 2, whether a solemn vow dissolves a marriage already contracted. A solemn vow would invalidate a marital contract because under a solemn vow the man does not possess himself and thus cannot contractually give himself to another. As St. Thomas puts it, he who takes a solemn vow contracts a spiritual marriage with God, which is much more excellent than a material marriage. Now, a material marriage already contracted annuls a marriage contracted afterwards. Therefore, a solemn vow does also. Article 3, whether order is an impediment to matrimony. Is the sacrament of holy orders an impediment to matrimony? In the West, holy orders is an impediment to matrimony since one vows celibacy in being ordained. In the East, it is an impediment to matrimony, as St. Thomas says, because they understand it simply to be an impediment by virtue of ordination, although a married man who is ordained in the Eastern rites can continue to make use of marriage, provided he was married before being ordained. As a final note, the precedents for continence as being connected with the priesthood we see in the Old Covenant, first of all in the words of the priest Amalek in 1 Samuel, who said to David and his men, I have no common bread at hand, but there is holy bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women. The priest here is connecting the marital embrace with ritual impurity, which would prevent one from taking the holy bread here, which is a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. Another example of precedence would be the historical fact that when priests in the Old Covenant served in the temple, they would live away from their wives for that time, again connecting continence with the service of the priesthood. Today, the impediment to holy orders is found in canon law, written in the following words as Canon 1087, those in sacred orders invalidly attempt marriage. Article 3, whether a sacred order cannot supervene to matrimony. A married man can theoretically receive the sacrament of holy orders, since it is conferred by God through his ministers, and marriage does not impede the grace of the sacrament being conferred. After all, we see the early apostles, at least with St. Peter, as being married before being ordained. Yet according to church law, depending on whether this ordination is in the Latin Rite or one of the Eastern Rite churches, the ordained may have to observe periodic continence or perpetual continence. In the West, for sure, celibacy after that ordination, again, depending on the law of the church. We then turn to question 54 of the impediment of consanguinity. Article 1, whether consanguinity is rightly defined. What exactly is consanguinity? It is defined in the article as the tie contracted between persons descending from the same common ancestor by carnal procreation. As the Latin word indicates, consanguinity means of the same blood. It is a tie of blood between those of common ancestry, and how one labels proximity of blood as well as what proximity is impermissible for marriage will be the subject of forthcoming articles. Article 2, whether consanguinity is fittingly distinguished by degrees and lines. Beginning with lines, there are direct lines and collateral lines. The direct line includes your parent, your child, your grandparent, grandchildren, etc. The collateral line would include your sibling, your uncle, your cousin, those you haven't descended directly from or haven't directly descended from you, but are connected by a shared origin somewhere up the chain, like your sibling and yourself are connected by shared parents. Next, we have what are called degrees, which we count along the already mentioned lines. And for degrees on the collateral line, you count up from yourself to the common ancestor and then down to the other person. So my sibling is related by second degree, my uncle by third degree, my first cousin by fourth degree. Now, there are different ways of doing this degree counting, but I'm going to assume this is how the church does the counting, since the Catholic Church does not allow one to marry their first cousin. Canon law states on consanguinity the following: in the direct line of consanguinity, marriage is invalid between all ancestors and descendants, both legitimate and natural. In the collateral line, marriage is invalid up to and including the fourth degree. Article 3, whether consanguinity is an impediment to marriage by virtue of the natural law. Anything that is an impediment or obstacle to nature we consider contrary to the natural law, with differing degrees of grievousness or departure from nature. And marrying one's first cousin or sibling is first of all an obstacle to chastity, because if one has the possibility of someday marrying, being intimate with one who is already probably living with them as family, the temptation to these sins of concupiscence would be greatly aggravated, which would impede natural law. Secondly, marriages of consanguinity would impair the mutual friendship and union of mankind, which is furthered by a man leaving his own small sphere of people and relatives and being united with the stranger and for life. Lastly, consanguinity would greatly hinder the relationships within the family. If a son married his mother, whom he was supposed to honor as a parent, but now she is to be submissive to her son as a wife, that seems conflicting. Or if a father married his daughter, she would now in the one moment be a kind of equal of his, yet still his daughter and student, which also seems conflicting. Both are examples of a kind of blurring, conflicting of lines which would in no way be advantageous to these relationships. For all of these reasons, consanguinity is contrary to the natural goods, the natural law of mankind. Article 4 in our last article, whether the degrees of consanguinity that are an impediment to marriage should be fixed by the church. And yes, the church can do this. St. Thomas describes briefly, our Lord said to his disciples in Luke 10:16, "He that heareth you heareth me. Therefore a commandment of the church has the same force as a commandment of God." Now the church sometimes has forbidden and sometimes allowed certain degrees which the old law did not forbid. Therefore those degrees are an impediment to marriage. And with that, we close another episode. We have just finished covering questions 53 and 54 of the supplement to the Summa, that is, of the impediment of vows and orders and of the impediment of consanguinity. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.